Welcome back, guys. Akira here, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about the fifth generation of home consoles. I wanted to do a small recap just because um, I was playing recently this generation of consoles, especially all three of them. And I know that even though now we have the nostalgia, or a lot of people have nostalgia for 6th and 7th gen stuff, so like PS2, 360, Wii, PS3 era stuff, GameCube especially, Dreamcast. Um, though those two consoles. Funny enough, a few years back, this was all the rave. This was all the hot stuff that everybody was going for. Um, Especially these two. This one has always stayed expensive when it comes to collecting, just because of how small the install base is for this console. Um, but these two were particularly, and you can start seeing a shift as these game consoles, at least for a lot of the games, the prices are going down. Like literally, like back like 4 years ago, 3 years ago, Nintendo 64 games were going for a lot, and and now they're starting to slow down. PS1 games, same thing. They're going down. They're getting cheaper, but you still have the very like obscure like RPG games or the very obscure horror games. Those are still gonna stay up in price. And then this has like 99% of the games library still very expensive. But yeah, if any of you guys are newer, thank you guys for joining in. And I a little bit about myself. I grew up with the seventh gen, and I discovered retro gaming and retro console through stuff like the Wii Virtual Console, the Wii Shop channel, or the Xbox Live Arcade through the Xbox 360 online store, or the PlayStation Network online store through the PS3. And those stores in particular would have retro stuff. So, for example, the Wii Shop channel would have like NES, Super Nintendo, TurboGrafx, Sega Genesis, Neo Geo, Nintendo 64 games, stuff like that. Probably missing a few. Xbox 360 had, um, some OG Xbox games on its store, and then they'll have arcade games and like old school Sega Genesis games, Sega Saturn games, stuff like that. Dreamcast games. Example: Daytona USA is a Saturn game. Echo the Dolphin is a Genesis game. Sonic CD, Sega CD game, and then stuff like Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, Jet Set Radio, Crazy Taxi. They're all Dreamcast games. Um, but yeah, and then the last one will be the PSN store through the PS3, which would have PS1 classics, PS2 classics, some arcade games, some Sega Genesis, Sega Saturn games, Sega CD, similar to the Xbox 360. But yeah, so that's how I discovered retro gaming. And then I was always more of a 3D game type of player. Like I prefer the 3D games because they were more immersive to me rather than 2D pixelated sprite based side scroller games. But I still like them regardless. Obviously, A Link to the Past, some of my favorite games of all time. Sonic the Hedgehog 2, Sonic the Hedgehog 3, etc. But yeah, so this particular generation of consoles, when I would do my research back in the day when I was little, through the 360 era, because that's where I grew up, the Wii 360 PS3, I would always be fascinated with this console. I'd be like, wow, this is the birth of 3D gaming. They look super polygon, but you can still see what they were trying to do. For example, the biggest examples that were stood out to me on N64 was Ocarina of Time and Mario 64 and how they would look like. Mario Kart 64, stuff like that. Like, Mario 64, you run around in 3D, obviously, blah, 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 Mario Kart, Ocarina. And then the PS1 games would always look super cool, super interesting. The ones that stood out to me was me seeing people play and then eventually playing myself, like Gran Turismo 1, Gran Turismo 2, Ridge Racer, Initial D, Final Fantasy 7, the original Resident Evil, and just other stuff like that. Tekken 1, 2, and 3, and then with Sega Saturn stuff that I got. I got like an interest in with stuff like Knights, look very cool. The Panzer Dragoon games, etc. That are alive. Um, so yeah, so I've always was very into this generation, and I will say for a while the Nintendo 64 was my favorite console of all time. At one point, this was my favorite console. Now it's not even my top 10, because unfortunately with that generation, you can tell that they start getting outdated. The games, they're outdated. You start to realize, if you're not blinded by nostalgia, you start to realize that they're clunky. um the cameras don't work good. It's just very primitive. Fun for its time, doesn't age, like 30 years later, or almost 30 years later. um so it's one of those things. For example, Mario 64, as much as that game is a very good game, a very high acclaimed, top tier game, I personally think it doesn't hold up as well. And if you were to put Mario 64, Sunshine, the Galaxy games, 3D World, or Odyssey, and you'll be like, here, you pick one. um I would pick any of those over Mario 64 to play now in 2024. I just find more enjoyment. And funny enough, I did that test recently. So it's just stuff like that, where it's like, it's no one's fault. It's just the technology just gets better and better. And I mean, that's a good thing, right? At the end of the day. Same thing with PlayStation, for example. As much as Resident Evil 1 and 2 are amazing, um, try playing that with its tank controls and stuff like that. I'm sure if you grow up with it, you're blinded by nostalgia and everything. I'm sure they'll still look as good to you as before and stuff like that. But wow, that's very difficult. And same thing with some Sega Saturn games. For example, I know Daytona USA, the Championship Circuit Edition doesn't control as good as the Daytona USA in the arcade did. Um, Although I will say, this for the Sega Saturn, since it had more 2D based games than these two, it you kind of feel it less. But still some like the early, like Initial D, it doesn't control as good as like the PS2 or the PS3 Initial D, stuff like that. Same example with these two. Um, but yeah, another thing I will say about this generation, um, is that you can tell these games were a product of their time. Um, and this was also the generation where video games exploded and went like legit mainstream. Obviously, I wasn't around for this era. I was born, towards the trail end of this, generation, going into like the sixth gen, the PS2, GameCube, etc., Dreamcast era. Um, but obviously, going back in retrospective, as from point of view of people telling me, or me watching interviews, or me watching documentaries, and just people telling me that grew up in this era, they're like, wow, this is where gaming went mainstream. Where like in the Nintendo era, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis era, it was going up and up, right, like at a steady climb, and then the PlayStation comes out and just boom, it just skyrockets. Like video games are like a cool thing. Back when it was like a niche, nerdy type thing now, and it was all thanks to the PlayStation. The PlayStation helped modernize, and it basically revolutionized how gaming is viewed mainstream and stuff. Obviously, you got Sony coming in. Um, they made tons of deals with third parties because they know that that's one thing that all these consoles that were coming in to rival the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. They know that the biggest thing is that a lot of them didn't have games. They would come out with the consoles, and then the games are like, where are the games? But Sony knew, beforehand, as they were developing this console, making deals with third parties, um, and they came up with tons of great games. This is by far the most successful console of this generation. Out competing these two. This sold around 102 million. This one only sold about 31, 32, and this one sold like 10 million. So it's like, these two combined don't even come like near half of this console's sales numbers. Another thing too is that this was the end of where Nintendo was king. And because they did a dumb mistake that probably still haunts them till this day. They stuck with cartridges, and it alienated and pissed off tons and tons of developers, and to the point where everybody in the industry was telling Nintendo, don't go with cartridges, these are too expensive, these are too troublesome, to work with. It's just you can't mass produce them as quickly as CDs, and it's just a pain in the ass. But Nintendo, they were hard-headed knuckleheads. They did not listen, and they stuck with cartridges, and now the Nintendo 64 is a cartridge-based console, um, and they lost stuff like most famously they lost Square Enix. I know companies like Konami and Capcom, even though they still made some games for this. There's still some Konami and Capcom games. They mostly went with these two. Capcom stuck with these two over this one. Square Enix went with PlayStation, jump shipped. I believe sports games they were mostly on these two. I'm sure obviously some sports games came out for this, but came out with these two. A lot of Japanese RPG games that a lot of the people were starting to embrace through the Super Nintendo era. Stuff like Chrono Trigger, Secret of Mana, the Final Fantasy games. All that momentum that would have built up and exploded with from going from the Super Nintendo to the Nintendo 64. Nintendo just cut it off, and all that fan base went over here to PlayStation. Nintendo just made a very dumb decision, and I think to this point, um, they still kind of do what they want to do. Sometimes it goes for their favor, sometimes it goes against them. The few times that it's gone, for their favor, sorry, was the Wii and the Switch. But then most of the time it's gone against them. GameCube, Wii U, um, as much as a success as as the 3DS is. Unfortunately, it didn't sell as good as the DS. Stuff like that. Um, but yeah, so that's one thing that Nintendo they stopped being a dominant force in this generation. And also, it goes back to a consequence of what they did in the previous generation, where they were gonna come out with a Nintendo PlayStation, where these Nintendo and Sony were gonna combine and make a console. Um, but Nintendo ended up betraying Sony at the end of the day, and then and then that led to the creation of the PlayStation. PlayStation came back with vengeance against Nintendo. They're like, "Screw you! You screwed us over. We were gonna make a console together." So now we made one, and we've been outselling Nintendo ever since. Besides the Wii, when it was a PS3 and the Wii, and the Switch right now is doing very high. Um, but although to be fair, the PS5 came out like 3 years after the Switch, so I wouldn't say that would be a fair um, comparison, since the Switch has 3 years ahead of the PS5. But anyways, other than that, this was also the first home console where I would say CDs were very relevant. CDs became mainstream. This is when CD media, it was the next step, the next evolution, and it was the logical um, step to make, because less how do I say, less money to produce. You were able to produce faster. Games were cheaper, stuff like that. So you got something like PlayStation opens with optical media with a disc, the CD-ROMs, and then same thing with the Sega Saturn, right? And including on top of that, they also included a CD player, so you could literally listen, grab a CD with music on it, put it in, and you listen. It's like a CD player. Same thing with the Saturn. Obviously this one cannot do it. Another thing is with that, since there are no batteries, to put in the cartridge to save the games, you will need stuff like memory cards. For here, the memory card will go here, right? And then the memory card in these two slots. And then the controllers, I will say Nintendo did revolutionize and did more with 3D. They had the analog stick that came with the Nintendo 64 controller. Meanwhile, these two came with basic controllers, with the D-pad and like the face buttons. And then later on came revisions, in 97, I believe, or 98, 97, they came out with the DualShock, as we know, with the dual thumbsticks. And Saturn, I believe it was 96, they came out with the 3D controller, which also had, the analog stick. So, props where props are. Nintendo did the analog stick thing first, and they followed suit because they set an example as for the future of 3D games. I will say the N64 is that has against these two is a 4-player port compared to the 2-player ports here, and it's more based on local multiplayer games. You don't have that. I don't think there's only like 2 or 3 JRPG games in this console. It's not very single player focused. It's more local multiplayer. Party games, stuff like that. Mario Kart, Smash, GoldenEye, Diddy Kong Racing. Those are the things that most people played and sold the best on the N64. Meanwhile, PlayStation had those things as well. You had your fun racing party games, your fun racing, sorry, your racing games, your party games, and your fighting games. And they're all local multiplayer games. So these, but also on top, it had the JRPGs, single player story games, cinematic games that as well as they could have done with PS1 with the full motion video, and then same thing with the Saturn. The Saturn had a bit of both, kind of like this one has the JRPGs, the fighting games, the arcade games, the arcade racing games, all that fun stuff. But yeah, unfortunately, when Sega came out with the Saturn, they rushed it because they were scared of Sony's imminent threat. So they released it in North America 6 months earlier than it was planned to be. Usually, consoles release in like November, holidays for that year, and they're like, shoot, we're scared that Sony's gonna outsell us. We need to, have a one up against them. So boom, they released it in May, and unfortunately with that, they did not tell retailers, that they were gonna release it, shadow drop it, and they were pissed. They have inventory room for inventory. Because of that, games weren't out there because developers were making the game, in mind that they were going to be released in November. But then it's like, oh, we came out in May, and it's like, bro, the games are like not done, because we were in the impression that the console's gonna come out in November, and that happened, and that just pissed off a lot of people. Then this comes out later that year, '95, and I believe it was September. And it was a smash hit. You had games that appealed to both North American and Japanese audience, and European and every other region. And then a year later, the N64 comes out with Mario 64 and Pilot Wings, and these two did not piss off a lot of the players like this one did. In certain, and when it comes to that, but then this console pissed off developers, through the cartridge space. Unfortunately, that led to the Sega Saturn not doing very good in America. That's why you've probably never heard of this console, or maybe if you've heard of this console, you've never seen it or owned it, because it's a pretty rare console. Only 10 million of them are out there. Well, that were sold. I'm sure less are out there because as time goes on, some get destroyed, some break down, etc., etc. So yeah, although I will say in Japan this is very popular. This was way more popular in Japan than it was ever in North America or any other part of the world. Excuse me. I believe around 1,400 games were out for Japan for this console. Meanwhile, here in America, around only 200 and something. So that's like, well, very small percentage of the whole library. And they're way more cheaper because they're more in Japan. That's why if you want to collect for this console nowadays, it's very expensive, and the cheaper alternatives to get Japanese games because they're more. The whole library is over there, and they're cheaper. Now with the N64, funny enough, it was a complete opposite of this in terms of sales. This did very well in North America when this didn't do very well in North America. But this did very poor in Japan when this did very well in Japan. So, for example, in North America, and I'm sure the other parts of the world, when it comes to sales number, this would be number 1, number 2, and number 3. But in Japan, for a while, this was number 1, number 2, and number 3. And then eventually, this became number 1, and then number 2, and number 3. So in every part of the world, this was, this stayed at the first place, but this one was second and this one is third. But in Japan was the only place where this outsold this. So it's like, wow, what must have happened in Japan that made the Nintendo 64 very unattractive? And to be honest, I still don't know the answer to that question. I'm very ignorant when it comes to that. Maybe one day, hopefully, I'll find out. And if you guys would love to know, I'll let you know. But it's just very odd, very weird to think about the cultural differences when it comes to consoles. I do know that in Japan, I will say in Japan, arcades, they didn't die as fast as they did here in America, and this has tons and tons of great arcade ports. So maybe that's one thing that attracted them. Also, another thing that I can see that attracted them, aside from the arcade ports, was stuff like JRPGs, where this did not have Japanese RPG games. So it's like, this seemed more attractive than the Nintendo 64. But yeah, so it's just very interesting thing to see. And then yeah, so and then what was I gonna say as well? Oh yeah, and then the Sony PlayStation, did well everywhere because they had everything that these two had. JRPGs, fun party games, etc., multiplayer games, fighting games, arcade games, all that stuff. Um, I will say that when I was growing up, as I said, this is my favorite console of all time. I remember I would love stuff like the Mario Kart games, the Smash games, etc. But I've always thought the controller was very weird, very odd. It was like in the middle. You would have to hold it as when you're younger, your hands are smaller. So I tried holding it like that. I tried holding it like that. It was very weird. Um, and as I was saying, these two controllers, they're more ergonomic, they're more comfortable, and they stood the test of time. Um, well, at least up until when Sega stopped making consoles, and then obviously you have the Dual Shock, which it's still the base to this day with the Dual Sense on the PS5. So you can see how these two stood the test of time. Or at least this one did until Sega stopped making consoles, because with the 3D Saturn controller, then you can see it's kind of like a prototype version of the Sega Dreamcast controller. But this one, like Nintendo quickly redesigned the controller when it came to their next consoles, because it was a very very strange choice, very strange choice. But yeah, so yeah, I guess I'll tell you guys some of my memories with these consoles and and my overall thoughts before we end the video. But yeah, so yeah, so Nintendo 64 is my favorite console for of all time for a while. I played tons of games in it. I loved it. But then as I started playing other consoles, other generations, I'm starting to see its age, and I'm going back. And to mind you, this is from someone that did not grow up with this console. I wasn't alive when this console came out. Um, so it speaks for how fun the games are. Multiplayer games, stuff like that. But some games don't hold up. Like I can still go back and play Ocarina of Time. I can still go back and play Mario Kart 64, Diddy Kong's Racing, Star Fox 64, stuff like that. But when it comes to like Smash 64, I'd rather play any other Smash game, to be honest. When it comes back to GoldenEye 007, as amazing as GoldenEye 007 is, no, please, I don't. It's a horrible time. I'm like, you're better off playing like GoldenEye 007, the reloaded version on PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 or the Wii version. Um, and Mario 64, so those are three examples of games that have not aged. And I would just prefer playing the newer versions of those games and the newer generations of the Nintendo consoles. Um, so that thing let me down, not like let me down, but it kind of like wow, like made me think, guys, made me realize, wow, this console is like, or at least yeah, this console is like overhyped to a certain extent. Obviously, it's good, it's overhyped for a reason, but like it was like overhyped. I'm like, wow, everybody's saying that the Nintendo 64 is the greatest thing in the world, blah blah blah, and I'm sure it was, but then it's like no, as I play other consoles and discover other games and stuff like that, you can start seeing its age. So unfortunately, nowadays I wouldn't even put it close to my top 10 when it comes to favorite consoles of all time. But it's not his fault. It's just the fault of the technology back in the day. So yeah. Now when it comes to the PlayStation, right? This console, I remember playing when I would play like the PS1 classics on the PS3, and then eventually on the PS4 and like the PSP and the Vita, because you can cross buy them. If you bought it on PS3 or PS4, you could download it into the PSP and the Vita. So stuff like with Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Cross, and the other one that came in mind was Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Games like that. I remember going back. I'm like, you know what? These games are really cool digital, but since I'm more of a physical stuff, because I know you don't own digital, digital content is not like really yours. That you can do whatever you want with it, like a physical thing. I was like, it'd be cool if I could go in and hunt down a PlayStation. So this is back in like, I want to say 20. Wow, must have been like I think around a decade or close to a decade ago. Um, I went and looked for a PS1, and I remember specifically there was a seller on a local, on the local marketplace, like the Facebook marketplace wasn't a thing back then, but stuff like OfferUp. Um, there was some guy was just selling this with two controllers, I believe. Yeah, two controllers, this memory card, and a CD stack of 50 games. And in those CD folders with the zip up and you have the like the pages of CDs, 50 games. or close to 50 games. It was like almost. I remember counting all the discs and everything, and it was all that for $50. And I was like, wow, okay, let me jump into that because it doesn't get any better. A huge stack of games with the zipper, the CD case with all the games, two controllers, a memory card, and a console, and then obviously the cords that comes with it. Also, when I played it, I was like, wow, this is obviously it's primitive. It came from this era, but I'm like, wow, this is fun. Um, some of these games hold up a little bit better than the 64 games, but then obviously there's some games in the 64 that hold up better than this. Right? So I was liking it. Gran Turismo 2. I was playing Gran Turismo 2. I remember, and there they have the Tomb Raider games. Tomb Raider's awesome. Uh, the Soul Reaver. I think there's Soul Reaver games. Final Fantasy. Obviously, 6, 7, 8, 9. All that stuff that I like. And then on top of that, I started. Another one too, Medieval. Proper the Rappers. All like the Sony first party stuff. That from there on, then it's like, wow, I really like the Sony first party stuff. They have tons of cool games. Kind of the Nintendo first party stuff. So it's like I wanted to like, it kind of like broadened my horizons when it comes to PlayStation, and then it just made me want to like discover that brand and the first party games, and then it led to me where I am now, where my favorite games, some of my favorite games of all times, are stuff like Little Big Planet, which is a PlayStation first party game. Toko de Moisio with the Toro Inoue, the Sony, the white cat. Go to Google and just literally just look up Toro Sony cat, and he's a Sony mascot. He's a PlayStation mascot in Japan. Unfortunately, I wish he was a mascot here, but he's not. Stuff like that, Uncharted, Last of Us, it just makes you discover it all. Even obviously those games did not come on the PS1, but they eventually came on later on PS3 and stuff. And then Crash Bandicoot, 3D, platformer, with mascots. It grew my love for that. As much as I really like Mario 64, and Sonic games. Well, not Saturn, but eventually Sonic Adventure and stuff. Um, this the PS1 with like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon, it kind of made me appreciate more like 3D mascot platformers. So eventually, when it came to the PS2, we had Sly Cooper, Jack and Daxter, and Ratchet and Clank, and then eventually now on the PS4, PS5 era, the most recent ones that come to mind will be Sackboy: Big Adventure and Astro Bot that's coming out. So without this, I probably would not discovered that appreciation. So that's a lot of things I have to thank for this console. So each console brings me a new experience, and then the latest one, the Sega Saturn. I remember for the longest time I really liked Sega, but it was more the common stuff. Genesis, to some extent Dreamcast, and obviously I discovered those through what I was saying, the seventh generation, kind of like how I discovered these through their retro games on their digital stores. And I remember being like, wow, okay, what's this console about? And I remember seeing Adam Korlik's video on the Sega Saturn and him doing it and explaining it. And I was like, wow, this is super amazing. And just the fact that most of the games are in Japan, like 90% of the games are in Japan and never came to America, it just made me very interesting. So, and then stuff like Daytona USA caught my eye, sorry. Nights into Dreams, Sonic Jam, which has Sonic 1, 2, 3, and Knuckles. And you can get them all in one. I just thought it was super cool. Instead of, them being an individual, the cartridges. What else? Dead or Alive. Stuff like that, like just other games that I have that I can't think of. If I were to go look at my shelf, they'll probably be able to pop in my mind. But yeah, so I was like, wow, okay, what is this about? And then as I'm playing this console and in the different games, the Japanese imports, I was like, wow, this is a very good underrated console. And I will say it's probably the most underrated console of all time. I would not give that to the Dreamcast because it's very well known right now that the Dreamcast is an amazing console. So by that definition, it would not be underrated because everybody knows it's an amazing console. But for example, an underrated console is a console that's amazing but nobody knows it, and I would say that title goes to the Sega Saturn. But yeah, as you see here, we have a Japanese version of the Saturn. They came in different colors like this one. It came in white, gray, silver, I believe. But here in North America, it came in black. I have the North American version as well. It's somewhere in my cabinet, but I wanted to show you guys the Japanese one as well. And And yeah, one thing I will say though, with this generation, the only one to get a revision or a remodel, like a slimmed down version, will be the PlayStation when they came out with the PS1. Because this one stayed the same model throughout the whole generation, and this one stayed the same model throughout the whole generation, except with a difference where the buttons, these are circle. The OG, the very first models from like the first year, it would be like more like oval buttons, and I believe there will be like a light somewhere here, if I'm not mistaken. I may be mistaken. I don't have that particular model. My Black North American is also like this second model with the circle button instead of the oval ones. And then yeah, I will say if I were to rank these consoles from favorite to least favorite, the PlayStation will be my favorite. The Sega Saturn will be my second favorite, and my least favorite out of the bunch will be the Nintendo 64. Obviously, these are not the only consoles from this generation. This generation had, I want to say, over 9 consoles, maybe more. But unfortunately, those consoles are extreme failures that don't exist. Obviously, don't exist anymore. But what I meant to say was, they're very hard to obtain through how rare they are and how much of a failure they are, that they were discontinued and they stopped manufactured very early throughout this production time, so very few of them were made. So obviously with that, very few of them are out there in the wild. And the reason why that is because in the fourth generation, where people would see that Nintendo was king throughout the third generation, and in the fourth generation where Sega stood up to them, and you had the Super Nintendo or Sega Genesis, it made other companies look like, wow, you don't have to be Nintendo to be king. Sega basically gave them confidence to stand up against Nintendo. So that's where you had stuff like the Philips CDI, the Neo Geo, the Panasonic 3DO, but that was all in the fourth generation, excuse me. So then when the new generation came out, everybody they threw their hat into the ring. They're like, okay, who's the next? It's like a battle royale. Who's the next one to stand up to Nintendo? Besides Sega, there has to be another person. So that's why it came out with tons of different consoles. I won't be able to name, for example, a few at the top of my head, right? These are not all the consoles that came out in this era. For sure, I knew that. I know that the Atari Jaguar. Atari came back in this generation with the Atari Jaguar. I know that in this generation also, Apple came out with a console. A lot of people don't know this, but Apple came out with the Apple Pippin. I want to say Neo Geo was last gen, right? Yeah, Neo Geo was last gen. Was Panasonic 3DO this gen or fourth gen? Whichever one, Panasonic, they came out with the 3DO. And tons of other different consoles that they threw their hat into the ring. And they all failed. Atari, the Jaguar, did not sell good. It discontinued shortly after. And that's a very rare console. Same thing with the Apple Pippin. And then, obviously we had one that stood up against these two. And it was the Sony. Sony was the one that planned everything right, did everything right. And, they're still alive, till this day, with the PS5 and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's what I want to tell you about this generation, is retrospective. I don't know. Hopefully, I explained right to those who grew up with this generation. Maybe I got some things wrong. You guys let me know in the comment if you grew up with this generation. What things did I get wrong? Correct me on things, since obviously was not alive through this generation. I only know this through the history. I guess before I go, if I were to name my favorite console for each, my favorite game for each of these consoles, I would say Ocarina of Time. If we're talking Japanese only library, Doko Demo Isio. If not, I'll probably give it to Final Fantasy VII. And then for Sega Saturn, it'll definitely be Nights into Dreams. Dead or Alive is a close one, but Nights into Dreams is my favorite one. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys later. Which one of these is your favorite console? And yeah, let me know if you guys have nostalgia. I'll see you guys later. Peace.